what is the spiritual substance here? Because there really is a lot in this book. What are the spiritual points that Cahill brings up, especially about Moses and Sinai and the Ten Commandments, the name of God, everything that we read for today? What did you find compelling in our pages that we've read so far? Compelling from a spiritual point of view, not just intellectual, but spiritual.
Well, I'm not sure this is very spiritual, but it's certainly intellectual, and that is that these characters in the narrative are by no means saints, and that's reassuring to me.
Are by no means what?
Saints. I mean,
Saints.
like the disciples. They do stupid things. They say stupid things. They sin, and yet they've, in a way, rewritten history, and that's, I say, reassuring to me.
Yeah, it's been pointed out, especially the book of Genesis, but even Exodus and on, is just one family dysfunction after the next. And it's one family, right? It's painted as one family from Abraham on, generation. They are far from perfect people. People are so fond of saying that my family is dysfunctional. You wonder if there are any functional families.
But then again, I picture that time, who would be, I would think it would be wild and woolly, just naturally. I mean, what would hold them together into some communal idea? Because they're so, people are so, well, nomadic, but unsophisticated, no, what is a word for these beginnings?
You mean sort of living rough, perhaps?
Rough. Very rough, yeah. And I would expect that they would have a concept only of survival and maybe happiness, sunshine, warmth. Or am I not giving them enough credit?
I was interested in the comment about the commandments, that it's God's code. No justification is required because they are really absolute truths. You can't argue them. I'm not saying people don't try. I'm not saying that people live with these, absolutely well, as we were just saying about, as Denny's point about the people involved weren't saints. But these are just absolute truths.
And
in my view, not arguable. And I was interested that, Cahill made that point.
And that they are written on the heart and then articulated on Mount Sinai. And, last week I said I just wanted to go back and talk a little bit about his previous book, which was how the Irish saved civilization. And that same point comes up in that book. The Irish before Patrick, tribal, marauding, murdering. And so why did Patrick's message resonate with them? And I think Cahill says, well, in the first place, because they didn't want to be murdered tomorrow. But there's kind of a recognition that there is a code that is written on our hearts that says something other than murder and marauding is the way to go.
Is that humanity from the beginning?
You mean that there's a moral code written on our heart?
Yes.
Or the marauding and murdering?
No, the moral code. Is that part of being human? Which came first?
You know who else makes this point is another author of another book we once read in WCC Reads, and that was Francis. Oh gosh, he's been on TV a lot lately because he's the director of the National Institutes of Health. We read his book about science and God. Sorry, I'm forgetting the name of the book and the author. I'll look it up and find it. But he makes a point early on that even though he was raised an atheist, he was persuaded by C.S. Lewis's argument that there is a moral center placed in every human being, whether they're believers or not believers, no matter what culture. And that, for C.S. Lewis and then for Francis, who finally came to Christianity through this realization, is proof that there's a little bit of God's moral truth that is built into every human being. Therefore, there must be a God. That's how Francis Collins. Nancy, do you remember?
Yeah.
Remember we read that book? Sorry. Well, you might not have been
I know
part of that
that name.
discussion. Francis Collins. Yeah, he's not quite as popular as Anthony Fauci on TV, but you see him. And he came to Christianity through this realization presented by C.S. Lewis in the book Mere Christianity, that there is implanted in every human being a moral heart that is a reflection of the divine nature and will. And that for him is all the proof for God that there needs to be.
Well, it separates us from the animals, doesn't it?
What else of spiritual benefit or any inspiration that you felt as you were reading these pages?
I like the idea of time. They said initially the Egyptians' time was circular. It was preordained, and that certain things happen in a certain moment in a year, and then it wouldn't happen again till the next year at the same time. And you could just rely on this, and each year was the same. And that Moses wanted to get away from that. Is this right? And Moses wanted to get away from that. And so he went into the Sinai, and where he adopted these ideas. Was it from God? I don't know. But his ideas that he was preaching as a new idea was the idea of time being, what was it? It went on, there was a past, present, and future, was that it?
Mm-hmm.
And the difference was that you regretted the past and you feared the future. And oh my gosh, what misery. And then I'm trailing here in my memory. Then there was another element of time.
Well, the present.
The present. Oh, the present, which is only take each day, because you have nothing in the future that you can predict, and nothing in the past that you can act on. The day is what is important, and do your best this day. Is that right?
Yes, you stated it very well. I was also inspired by that passage. Do others remember reading that? And what did you think about it?
But
Well, it reaffirms that we are in control of our destiny to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
because it's not a static world and the future is unknown. In the present day, we have this awesome responsibility of making sure that when we step out, when the future comes, it will not be oblivion for Abraham personally, taking that step out from the Sumerian culture, he could have said, well, no, I'll die if I do this, but he didn't. And so just that sense of the personal responsibility that living in a world that is not a static world places on us is awesome, frightening, and Cahill would also argue ultimately joyful, because we have the tools that the Jews gave us to step into the future, to be in the present that will take that step into the future.
Yeah, well said. His emphasis seems to be on our ability to act in the present. And as Nancy just said, not just ability to act in the present, but responsibility to act in the present. No one can say they have no agency. In fact, everyone can say, I do have agency, even if you have less agency or power relative to another human being. Every human being has some power to do or not to do, to speak, to not to speak, how to even adjust your inner life in the way that you see the world. I often say, as a spiritual director and a pastor, you can't change other people and you can't change circumstances all the time, but you can change how you perceive other people and how you perceive the world. And in fact, to live well, you have to kind of change how you perceive things, because otherwise they'll become overwhelming. If you go out there and try to change everybody but yourself, it'll be quite frustrating. I've tried, it doesn't work. But you can always pay attention to your own functioning, and you can always affect it, always. And that's good news. It's also a bit challenging. You have no one else to blame for what you do in the world, but you can take responsibility. Now, I'm thinking of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was a much later 19th and 20th century Jewish leader in the civil rights movement. He always said, that's what the prophets taught us, is you got to use whatever you got to do whatever you can to leave this world a better place. And there is no excuse for not doing something. Everybody can do something.
That I'm struggling with a question, but it builds on what you just said, Jeffrey, and that is, let's assume for a minute that Abraham and Moses are mythological characters, but they've been invented for a reason. And the question is, what is the reason? Is it because, and I think it may just be survival, but maybe you're suggesting it's more than survival. It's survival in doing good. If the Jews are captive in Babylon, they need to establish a history of their race so that they have an identity. It's like a football team always needs an identity. The Bears are a running team, or not. And the Jews needed to resist their captives. I'm making this up, but I think it's sort of true. And they needed heroes, if you will. And that's why I ask, why did these stories, why were they written at the time they were written? I'm not smart enough to know the history, but I can see why they survived, and that's because they tell the story of a race, of a people, and we all need to know, I think we need to know what our history is. Does that make sense?
Yep. And that's what I learned in seminary. The Jews sitting by the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Babylon realize that if they don't write this stuff down and pass it along to their children, there's no future. But if they do write it down, there is a future for them. And exactly as you're saying, Denny, they always had to keep in mind, what do these stories say about us as a people? How are we different from other people? Mm-hmm. And all they knew for those several generations they were in Babylon is Babylonian culture and religion and ethics. And it's no surprise that they adopted some of those practices and beliefs, but they also said, but we're different. Mm-hmm. And as I recall from seminary, the professors told us that the 10 Commandments probably existed, maybe even in written form, before they got to Babylon. So the 10 Commandments may be some of the most ancient material in the Hebrew Bible, along with that brief story, that brief song by Miriam, Moses' sister, that Cahill refers to. The Lord has thrown the enemies into the sea, or whatever. I remember in seminary that there might have been a few snippets that were written down, but were really at the heart of Israelite religion by the time they got to Babylon. But it was in Babylon they put it all together, sort of from Eden all the way through the Kings, and made it one more or less comprehensible story, as if to say, we are chosen, but we're chosen for a purpose. And chosen doesn't mean we are chosen to have privileges. It means we're chosen to be a light in the world and make the world a better place. And that, to me, kind of sums up the Hebrew Bible. But it all came together in a context of exile.
I have to ask, as far as progression, seeing this happen, before Christ, how many years before Christ, and then Christ's birth, and now where we are today. Somebody in this church, I can't say his name, but I don't know. You tell me as I go on whether I can mention who's saying this. Somebody has a theory about the New Testament, saying that it shows a progression of the world getting better and better, and it's about the idea of human beings learning and achieving more for the betterment of everyone. And so the question is, how much more is there to learn from what we're talking about 20,000 years before Christ and today, as it appears in the Bible? How many other things are conquered or highlighted as an achievement, for mankind? Is there such a progression that you see?
That's a good question, Nancy. Thanks. What do others see a kind of progression in moral progress? May I call it?
Yeah, moral progress, or the good life. No, moral progress. And equality for today's issue. So. And
you're seeing, or at least citing someone else who sees that as a developing theme in the Bible?
Yes, in the New Testament.
And even beyond to today?
He's talking about, he said, Nancy, don't you think the world's better off today? And I said, I don't know. And he said, well, I think so. And then he went on to say all the things and I said, yeah, you're right.
What do others think about that? And what do you think Cahill might say about that?
I was just looking in the book on page, I think it's 155, about the Jews and their bias toward the underdog, and that it is still a Jewish sense of justice. And Am I right that it's Martin Luther King who said the arc of history bends toward justice? So,
He was citing Unitarian minister Theodore Parker, but King gets the credit for it.
okay, well, he's probably a little better known. So it seems to me these days that our country is very fraught. But I think there are issues that are coming to the fore that people are grappling with that do speak to a sense of justice. I hope. I'll just add that.
I agree, Shelley.
I agree. I think justice is at the root of most of our tension.
And remember, in terms of the Hebrew Bible, the first full books to be written down were not any of these stories from the first 10 books. They were the writings of the Hebrew prophets, especially Isaiah, chapters 1 through 39, Hosea, Amos, and so on. And they're all about how do we live responsibly in light of a righteous God. And I think Cahill, who doesn't really deal yet in these pages with the prophets, would say about the stories in Genesis and Exodus that let's remember that this isn't just an abstract moral code that is introduced out of the blue at Sinai. This is a moral code in response to a relationship with a good, just, loving, and personal God. And in fact, whether you say it's the first 2 commandments, 3 commandments, or 4 commandments are really about God, no matter how you count it, the commandments themselves begin with right relationship, not with each other, but with the divine. And that you can't then neatly separate love of God and love of neighbor. They always go together. And who said that?
I don't know.
Who said the most important commandment is to love God and love your neighbor? Somebody we know?
Jesus.
Jesus of Nazareth. So, so much of Jesus' ministry just seems to be an echo of the key concepts of the Hebrew Bible.
And just expanding on what you just said a little bit, I think, when Jacob, who becomes Israel, sees the face of God, what Cahill posits is that because Jacob has seen the face of God, when he sees his brother Esau, whom he terribly wronged, and Esau basically forgives him, that encounter with God shapes Jacob's encounter with his brother and probably gives him the courage to actually see his brother. And I think Cahill says that, and this is just kind of Cahill's idea. I don't know whether it is really true or not. That lifts the dignity of human beings. As Denny said earlier, we're not animals.
It seems to me all throughout Jewish history, even within the scriptures, there's always a looking back to the Exodus story as the most foundational of all the stories. The idea that who is God? God is the one who frees the oppressed. I don't know that we need to say any more about religion or the Bible.
Right.
But that means that when we love our neighbors, especially those of us who are people of faith, we're not doing it because it makes us feel good or because our parents told us that that's the right thing to do. Ideally, we love our neighbor because our neighbor is created in the likeness and image of God. And it is put within our heart by that same God who is love to live love in all we do with ourselves, our neighbors, and the earth. But a lot of, here I'll be critical here in a moment, of religious liberals. I think we religious liberals, I'll include myself, are quick to jump to the ethical part of religion over the religious part in terms of having a warm, intimate, heartfelt sense of God's presence in our lives. That kind of language we think is what maybe Baptists talk about, but we don't we don't do that around here. And I always, I grew up Methodist, where we were taught that our founder, John Wesley, I'm speaking like I'm still a Methodist. I guess I will always be a little bit because I grew up that way. John Wesley felt his heart strangely warmed on the day of his conversion. He felt his heart strangely warmed, is how he wrote it down. He was already a priest in the Church of England. My God, you would think he's religious enough. But for the first time, he really felt that God is not just a word or something you learn about in your head, but somebody you can actually feel within you. And it completely changed his life. And he started preaching in the coal mines of England, where the the Church of England would not go. If you were a poor coal miner in England, you were supposed to go to the church. The church wasn't supposed to come to you. And Wesley said, "The whole world is my parish." That's another great quote of his. The whole world is my parish. Wherever people suffer, that's where I'm called to go. So as a Methodist, I grew up with the sense that warm-heartedness with God always goes hands in hand with love of neighbor, that they can never be separated.
I grew up a Methodist too, but I just grew up singing the great hymns.
Yes, the singing Methodists.
But there's more to it.
I was a church nerd as a child, paying attention to what the pastor was saying.
You're making me think about a question that I have on page 109, if I'm reading it right here in the dim light. He talks about the three ways we could interpret Yahweh. Okay, I can get that Yahweh is the creator. Yahweh is not to be controlled. But then the third, I will be there with you. This, kind of the Baptist approach. I will be there with you. This is Fox's translation following Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig, which emphasizes God's continuing presence in his creation, his being there with us. And so I just wondered, I don't think that Cahill gives a lot of evidence for that, except, okay, Abram heard the voice. Moses encountered God in the burning bush. Just talk about that a little bit more. I will be there with you.
Yeah, I find this is one of my critiques from last week, but I want to stay positive today. I find his whole book to be written in broad strokes without much evidence and support. Okay, positive. I remember in seminary learning that third way is I will be what I will be, which is not so relational as this translation. So this is actually new to me. I will be there with you. I also remember in seminary that these names for God can be translated lots of different ways. And that the reason that it could be sort of past tense, present tense, future tense, what does it mean? Is to really say that this God is hard to pin down and control. Thank you, God, for giving me your name. Now, what the heck does it mean? Who are you really? And doesn't he quote later in the book Augustine, who says something like, if you think you understand God, you don't? Doesn't he say that somewhere in today's reading? It was a great quote. In fact, I'm going to use it on Sunday in spiritual enrichment.
I think there was a response of Augustine to after Moses comes down with the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not murder. Then he goes out and murders some proportion of the people whom he was leading. And then we have Augustine's comment, which I don't remember exactly what it was.
Yeah, I found it. It's page 159.
Okay.
Augustine, whatever, doesn't matter. We are talking about God. Which wonder do you think you understand? If you understand, it is not God. Which I take to mean that the moment you think you have a full understanding of these mysteries, that's when we need to pause, pull back, and put our humble boots on and say, whatever this is all about, there's a lot more we don't know than what we do know. And we approach these matters humbly and with reverence.
That's so beautiful because nothing's cut and dry, ever. So that fits my personality just fine.
You know, I had a different take. If I could go back to the "I will be there with you" line, it comes to me as a New Testament. I think Mark or Matthew says, "I will be with you always till the end of time."
Yeah, Matthew. Yeah.
That's how I read that. And
So
you know,
it's
get another
almost
case
incarnational. Almost incarnational.
I don't know.
Almost, but not quite. I mean, this is not a fully incarnated God in the Hebrew Bible, but the idea is certainly powerful. And
Well, could it be, I will be with you always, is like just what I was referring to, the WCC member who said the New Testament is nothing but the progression of good. Don't you think things are getting better? I will be with you always, meaning, you know, there's always goodness to achieve or to re-examine. Or if you think you know God, you don't, because it's complicated, you know, by the 22nd century, whatever's going to happen. And so, yeah, that's the point.
well, this is the meaning of covenant too. Covenant is not, God's covenant with humanity is not revocable. It is never breached, is a consistent theme in the Hebrew Bible and in Jewish theology. We, on our end, may seek to sever the covenant, but it's an eternal covenant. We can be as disobedient and wayward as we may be, but God is always extending that olive branch, that hand, whatever metaphor you want to use, and never withdraws relationship. Never. God gets pretty pissed off at the people. That's very clear. But does God ever withdraw from Israel? Even when Israel might feel that God has withdrawn, whether they deserve it or not, they may feel that God has withdrawn. But does God ever withdraw? In the 20th century, late 20th century, several Protestant denominations sought to understand Christian anti-Semitism. 2,000 years of the Christian church criticizing Judaism, basically. And the traditional Christian attack on Judaism is called supersessionism. The idea that the covenant in Christ has superseded God's covenant with the Hebrews made on Sinai. Well, first made with Abraham and then reaffirmed at Sinai. basically saying that the old covenant was abrogated and superseded by this new, better covenant, an exclusive covenant with those who know God through faith in Christ, whether they're Jewish or Gentile. That has been the historic 2,000-year argument why Christianity is superior.
I always was taught that.
Right. Everybody was taught that growing up.
Yes.
But so fast forward to the late 20th century, after the Holocaust, Christian theologians have had to question this because that's what got us to the Holocaust.
Yeah.
So the United Church of Christ and other denominations in the late 1990s passed resolutions saying, we officially condemn the theory of supersessionism. Why? Because when God established the covenant with the Jews through Abraham, reaffirmed at Sinai with Moses, it was an eternal covenant. And even Paul said, the covenant of God through Jesus Christ does not replace the covenant made by God with the Jewish people. It just makes it broader. And so Jews, therefore, don't need to convert to Christianity. Because the old trope was that Jews needed to convert. And Protestant theologians, and I think Catholic too now, say that's hogwaller. The Jews have always had a relationship with God because God never abandoned God's people. To say that God abandons God's people is to say God is not God.
Yeah.
And yet there are always people who are still saying that you can only go to heaven through faith in Jesus Christ. And if you don't have faith in Jesus Christ, you're not on God's good side.
Yeah.
What about the Jews? Them too. And that's how that's been addressed recently by recent theologians.
When it gets into this perfection, I just kind of let it wash over. I mean, I don't know, it strikes me as, well, I don't know, Jeffrey. I love your explanation because I've never heard it worded before. But oh my gosh, is it all necessary? You know, that kind of reaction.
Is what necessary, sir?
This logic. To me, it's just common street sense that everyone has the same God, you know, kind of thing. And my whole ideas come from that.
Regardless of what religion?
Yeah, regardless of all this chatter and
well,
debate.
The problem is when there are some people saying, no, you have to believe in our religion.
Yes, I understand. Yes.
Because our religion is clearly the only religion and the
Right.
right religion, which makes your religion the wrong religion.
And I could talk endlessly on that.
As I recall, you have a sister?
A sister who, yes, in fact, the minister is a converted Jew to Christianity. And the nonsense I hear is just mind-boggling.
Well, because the nonsense is out there, that's why theologians have felt it necessary to speak up to it.
Mm-hmm.
And anti-Semitism is still with us, sadly.
Yes.
Right? So we need to have some understanding as Christians, if possible, how to address our sister, our
Yes.
cousins, our neighbors who may be quick to condemn people of other religions, especially Jews. When Jesus himself was a Jew and you're condemning Judaism, what is this?
Well, I don't want to go in the tangent, but I would just say that my sister doesn't condemn Jews, nor does her church. I mean, I don't know why. I don't know what they do and why they do it. But they don't do that. They like going to Israel and chatting it up. And I don't know.
So Christian evangelicals say about Jews that they may not believe in this life, but when Jesus comes back,
That's right.
Jesus is going to give them one more chance.
That's why they're going to Israel.
At Judgment Day, yes. So Christian evangelicals go to Israel and
Yes.
support the modern state of Israel because they see the establishment
Yes,
of Israel in 1948 as a sign
that's right. Thank you.
that Jesus is coming back soon. And when Jesus comes back,
Yes,
there will be an accounting for Jew and Gentiles, and to the Jews, there will be one more chance.
like I said, they have all these precise particulars.
And what happens to them if they say no? It's the same fate as unbelieving Gentiles. Eternal damnation.
Yes,
Have we taken this conversation too far afield?
yes.
No, I think it's very interesting. I had never heard about
Supersessionism.
Yeah, I'd never heard about that before.
It's the noun form of superseded. Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the points that Cahill makes is that there is no, the 10 Commandments, if you obey them, there's no, okay, then you're in, or you're out if you don't. It is simply a matter of one's own integrity. And so I think that that kind of speaks in a way to this sense of a future judgment on one's life.
Yeah.
The judgment
It's more-
is within one's own soul, within one's own psyche.
Yeah.
Do I have the integrity of having deeply integrated these 10 commandments into my life?
These are the marks of the covenant people.
And that's its own reward.
This is who we are. This is what we do. But it's who we are. It's who we are because of our relationship with God and God's call to us. You were saying, Nancy, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say our identity.
Yeah, it's who we are.
As Denny, you helped me, Denny, by saying, yeah, if you're a sports team, you got to have an identity. Okay. I see this more clearly now. Thank you.
Stick with me, Nancy.
I would love to, Denny.
So several places in Leviticus, I think, it says, you'll do this, you do this, do this, do this, do this. Sort of an explanation of the 10 Commandments in great, great detail that Cahill talks about. Look at those verses sometimes. I want to say it's around Leviticus 16 to 19, that general area. It says, do this, do this, do this, do this. Why? Because God is perfect and we worship a perfect God. And then Jesus says the same thing. Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Now, perfection is a very high standard.
That's a tough one.
But wouldn't it be better to belong to a faith family that has high moral standards?
Also compassion, excuse me.
And with compassion.
Yes,
Right?
for us sinners, yes.
Yes. But if Jesus says, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect, I think he's just echoing his own Bible, his own tradition.
Mm.
Mhm.
So morality isn't an effort. It's if God lives in us and God is perfect, then how can we not be loving? Now, we know we're not all the time. And also the book of 1 John in the New Testament, the whole New Testament is as much Jewish as it is Christian and Greek and so on. But the book of 1 John says, if God is love, then love one another. It's like, duh. And yet we need these reminders. I do anyway. We're made for love. What else did you find inspiring, spiritually beneficial?
That quote from Allen Ginsberg that
Yeah.
something to the effect
All people.
of a kind of unlikely source, but that all poetry has its, and I'm paraphrasing here and maybe I don't get it quite right, all poetry has its genesis in the burning bush, the fire, which does not consume, which
Yep.
purifies us.
Yep. 160. Yep.
So this sense that as human beings, we are called to be deeply reflective, to allow ourselves to be changed.
That's a great page, 164. He starts with T.S. Eliot. He ends with Allen Ginsberg.
Yeah, yeah.
Talks about fire as both passion and an opportunity for refining. Yeah, I think a lot of us, sadly, our religion doesn't have a lot of passion and fire. Why is that? I think we're afraid of being confused with Pentecostals. I don't know.
I have a comment on music in regards to that. We don't want to look like Pentecostals, so we don't have this fire in our bellies. But I was thinking of the fire in my belly when I hear beautiful ecclesiastical music, or when I watched Prince Philip's funeral. If any of you remember the music that they played outside with was brass band, classical brass band music. And it was stunning, and it was so glorious with these big high furry hats and playing funeral dirges and the choreography where the men would slowly bow as the band was still playing this music, and so I can get raptured up. And, if you combine that with a good sermon, I'm there.
A little pageantry, a few good words.
Yeah.
Cahill's comment at the top of 164 was, we must be consumed either by the anger of the storm god or by the love of the living God. There is no way around life and its sufferings. Our only choice is whether we will be consumed by the fire of our own heedless fears and passions, or allow God to refine us in his fire and to shape us into a fitting instrument for his revelation. Wow, that would preach. Cahill is something of a preacher here at this moment. Good for him.
Getting back to what you were saying, Nancy, I agree that music can stir us in ways that words just don't. And so thank you for, bringing that to our discussion.
Thank you, Nancy.
What else do people find of benefit here in these pages?
Well, for me, who is not very, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Sally.
I was just going to say, for me, who is not very conversant with the Bible, it's a learning experience. Valuable. And there are certain things that foreshadow later times. And I find that interesting.
What'd you have in mind?
Such as, well, I'll have to go, the part about sacrificing baby boys, you know, the precursor to the birth of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
That's the one that pops to mind, but there's some others. That particular one was on page 100.
Yep.
Just so I just find that interesting, and I think there were other occasions in the book so far, not only in the reading for this week, but prior week.
And that comes out of a culture that does not recognize, is not walking with God and with neighbor. The idea of sacrificing a child, or not so much even sacrificing, but just murdering a child.
And in that particular instance, sort of wholesale, across, broad-based.
Mm-hmm. And Herod himself, I mean, that was wholesale.
Yeah, exactly.
The commentary that I use mostly for the Gospel of Matthew emphasizes Jesus as the new Moses, and says that Matthew's Gospel, sort of from beginning to end, is a conflict of kingdoms. Just as the Exodus story, we have the conflict of kingdoms, God's kingdom as represented, God's will as the deliverer, represented by Moses, the instrument of deliverance, over against Pharaoh's army and might and oppression and brutality. Along comes the story of Jesus and Matthew's telling of it. According to this commentator, Matthew consciously included these elements from Exodus to help us understand that just as Moses was the deliverer of the people in his day, Jesus is a deliverer of his people over against the wicked kingdoms of this earth, Herod, and even Caesar in our own day. And the giving of the law at Sinai, according to this commentator, is paralleled by Jesus delivering the law on the Sermon on the Mount. So we have a mountain in Exodus and we have a mountain in Matthew. In Luke's gospel, Jesus delivers the same sermon. It says on a level place. But in Matthew's gospel, Jesus goes to the top of the mountain as like a new Moses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Where does this fit in with, someone in the book that made a brief reference to what is in the London Museum in art, as far as like King Tut artifacts. And that when you go to the museum and look at the artifacts, you are looking at something in Jesus's time, or is it in Moses's time?
Was that mentioned in the book?
Yes,
or?
yes.
I remember he was talking about Tutankhamun.
Yes, and he was talking about artifacts of gold and the beautiful
Yes, where was that?
accoutrements of civilization. And yet it's not mentioned in the Bible. And then he goes into great detail about why. It's so, I thought I understood it. He was saying, we've got to keep our mind on the subject matter, which is the Lord. And we're not going to talk about gold and sapphires and stuff.
Oh, that's, I think, in the book where Cahill is talking about the story of the Exodus being set in a, what he calls a culturally neutral setting, right? The desert doesn't have palaces and gold streets and so forth. It's nature at its rawest, which, as I recall Cahill's point there, it was to say that what was important was the story story of who God is and how God relates to people intimately with deliverance, as opposed to the point being, look how materially well off the people are. I think that was his point.
Well,
And that's distracting
yes,
from the main point, which is the awesomeness and power of God.
yeah, which is the purpose of whoever is writing. But my question is, I'm fascinated at what century is the Bible in time with King Tut or like Herod, for instance. And I'm picturing women with bracelets on their arms and silks. I mean, I'm picturing some fancy things. Does Jesus live in that time?
Jesus lived in the time of Herod, yes.
Okay, and Herod
And-
built the pyramids.
No, that would be Pharaoh.
Who's first?
Pharaoh,
So Jesus is after the pyramids.
yes.
I never knew that.
And to my previous point about the author of Matthew trying to paint Jesus as a new Moses, remember that it's in Matthew where Jesus, his mother and father go to Egypt, where they're fleeing Herod. They find freedom in Egypt to come back. So Jesus is also kind of a prince of Egypt,
Ah,
just as Moses was a prince of Egypt.
yeah.
The parallels between Matthew and Exodus are many. And Pharaoh is a kind of Herod, but Herod is also a kind of Caesar, because at the time of when Matthew was written, Herod wasn't on the throne in Jerusalem, but Caesar was very much in charge in Rome.
Blowing my mind.
And the entire Bible can be understood as God, the majesty and power and authority of God over against all earthly rulers, who all of whom seem to think they're God.
Does in that kind of encounter with the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh has usurped God's power.
It's so interesting for me because I never let any of that language go into my head.
Mhm.
And so I've read the word Pharaoh before or Herod, but I never pictured it with my knowledge of Egypt. I always pictured it as a fairy tale. I never bothered.
Joseph, Jesus' father, has something else in common with Joseph in Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
They are both dreamers. And again, it's another parallel between the book of Matthew and the book of Genesis and Exodus and Genesis. They both see visions in
amazing.
dreams.
I hadn't thought about that before.
Yeah.
And just why don't you talk about that a little bit more, Pastor Jeffrey?
Yeah, the whole idea that God achieves God's will through any means, including dreams. And in the ancient world, dreams were a medium of divine communication. And so just as Joseph was a dreamer and saw various ways in which God was at work to eventually make him an overseer right next to Pharaoh, and to eventually benefit his people. Likewise, Joseph, Jesus' father, is warned in a dream not to go back to Nazareth the regular way because there's a band of Herod's people out to get him. So he goes back to Nazareth by a different road. So it's the author's way of saying God will use whatever way God wants, including dreams, and people who receive dreams and act their dreams in order to bring about the world that God wants.
Jungians would say that the dreams are still very spiritually, a spiritual resource for us.
Yeah, absolutely. As a spiritual director myself, I often ask my clients to tell me about their dreams. I don't know if you know, in my other life outside of the church, I work as a spiritual director.
I didn't know that.
It's my side hustle. And one of the things we might talk about is, what's your dream life like?
Huh.
Because whether it's psychology or spirituality, I think what's going on then when we're sleeping, I think our mind is working out a lot of very significant issues.
Mhm.
And yeah, this is ancient wisdom, really, that holy things happen in dreams. They can also be holy terrors.
Yes.
So out of this awesomeness that the world is not static and that we have a responsibility in the present to shape the future, which is unknowable. Here are the resources that first the Jews got us into this, not a static world. Here are the resources that we can use to not wake up in the morning and cover ourselves with a pillow and say, I can't do it because it's too awesome, too horrible. I mean, the consequences could be too horrible.
And what are those resources?
10 Commandments, Yahweh, burning bush.
Living in the present, which we've already talked about.
Still small voice inside.
And just this awesome narrative.
Or that we're all equal. That is empowering. Including, whatever's up there, it makes you feel like you're not the only, there's more to it than just you. That feels good.
Cahill makes this point somewhere in these pages that what the Jews inevitably faced was not only a God who was their tribal God, just for them, just for here, in this, our little tribal area, but the creator of everything, which means this God is also the God of the Gentiles. What does that mean then? That the people who don't look like us, worship like us, act like us, are still God's people as much as we are. Does that take away from our specialness? Or does it give us work to do to help everybody see their divine nature and their divine worth and dignity?